Okay, sure. I think
Yeah,
Aryan has it anyways. So,
yeah. So it's being recorded right now. So hello everyone. My name is Pjotr. I'm going to be the one giving you the workshop. I have been debating for a while. I've debated Euros and Worlds and broke at them. I've judged at them and also broke. And also I give a lot of workshops for the Dutch competitive platform, which is just a way for Dutch people to just get better at debating. Um, So I've been asked to make a workshop for novices, specifically trying to explain to you how to do prep time well. So the way I like or tend to like my workshops is to be a bit more interactive than normal. So I'm gonna have a couple of questions ready at some of the slides. And it is the idea that you're actually going to partake in them. So there are open questions. I've written some stuff down for myself, but the idea is that you're actively participating. So if you want to do so, please do so and have it ready. And I also expect you at some point to answer me. So have those things ready. Okay. That being said, welcome to the workshop. What I'm going to focus on is going to be just what do you kind of like need to prove arguments, because oftentimes this still tends to go wrong with people, that they're focusing too much on one thing and not everything else that they need to do. Then I'm just going to give you an overall structure you can use for prep time and why I organize it that way. And then I'm just going to give you some ideas on how to create arguments. That's to say, generating content and that kind of stuff. Because a lot of novices are struggling with motions or ideas. I'm just going to give you a couple of questions you can ask yourself to create a better. And then after that, I'm going to also talk to you about how you can communicate best during prep. During the workshop, I'll try to also highlight what the differences are between opening and closing halves. But if you think that maybe that's a bit unclear, you can of course always ask a question. And also, if you have any questions about the slides I'm talking too quickly, or you just want to know what I mean, or with an example, you can also raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask a question. Is that already a question? Because I'm hearing some background murmur. Nope. Okay, that's absolutely fine. So, what are kind of arguments? It's very, very easy. It's basically always two parts. It is explaining why something is true, which I often tend to just call mechanization, and also just explaining why something is important, which is impacting. What oftentimes people tend to forget the moment they tend to become a bit better than they were before is that they don't link to the motion. So they just have like an argument, which will be about, oh, we're going to talk about polarization in politics, and they don't really link to the motion. They're just talking about general things that are like creating polarizations that people don't really communicate with each other, but they don't really explain why it's linked to the motion. So it's always important to maybe have on your sheet, on your prep sheet, ready to write like what is the link to the motion? Why is this motion so important for this argument? And also to have headers. So basically, a header is just whenever you're going to say, in your speaking, you're going to say, what I'm going to try to prove now is this claim. And then after that, you're going to explain, the thing you're doing. And then after that, you can be like, okay, I'm now going to explain why this is important, that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, you can also use the chat to actually ask any questions. That's also a good way to ask questions. So that is important. If you want to be really fancy, you also can do weighing. That's the moment that you're not just actually just impacting, explaining why something is important. You're actually explaining why something is more important than something else. And then you just, it's just like impacting being a bit more comparative. That's how I would describe it. So yeah, these are basically what you need to do for arguments. Let's see. Yeah, so what's then the structure of prep time? So first thing that you need to do is you need to see if both of you understand the motion. So take the first 30 seconds to see this. This can be important because sometimes a person really doesn't understand what the debate's about, or you don't know what a specific word means, or there's like general confusion. And then it might be best to just set the record straight immediately. Because if you now have two people who start to think by themselves, and one person is just like figuring out the info slide or figuring out what the motion is about, and the other one already kind of like knows it, it would be better to just start immediately, have this common conception of what you know. And this is just quickly saying, like, do we understand the motion? Do we agree? Yes. And then you start thinking by yourself, which is basically then the second thing is have time to think by yourselves. So I have coached some teams, and sometimes people start talking immediately. So they already have ideas, or they try to have this consciousness of thought where they're just going to talk and talk and talk, and then that's the way that they find arguments. Um, but what I've found is when you force people to have time by themselves, they tend to be a bit more creative. They think about more arguments. They tend to be a bit more thorough because they've had time to explain what they exactly mean. And they also tend to be actually a bit more time efficient because they've already thought about what they are trying to say. And then they're going to, maybe find a wording that is just very clear and very useful to communicate. So I would definitely recommend to have some time by yourself. Sometimes this can be done relatively quickly. If you already have a lot of ideas and you have written them down and you don't need that much time, then this can already be done in just like 2 minutes. Sometimes you are not that creative and you feel like if you maybe take a bit more time, then you are able to do this like just within you'll be able to get that extra argument that you take a bit more time. That's where you're kind of like leading to the 5 minute mark. Try not to make this too long. Try to do this relatively, you know, shortly, as short as you can, and maybe also try to practice this if you're new. Because at the moment you're able to already come up with quite strong argumentation or just already have an idea of what you kind of need to prove each argument. That is the time that communication becomes better to do later on. Like if you already have that solid basis, then communicating becomes easier. So then what's then the rest of the time you're going to spend? I think for 5 minutes, it's kind of like try to communicate with each other. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail when you should communicate what and kind of like how. So I won't do that in this slide in detail. But the main idea is just you already start kind of like discussing what are the arguments that you think of. And then what you can do is you can shortly kind of like have maybe ideas on how to prove them. So maybe you have some illustrations or examples, or maybe some framing. So kind of like how does the world actually look like, or kind of like reasons why something is true. If one of the speakers who's kind of like bring this argument is already quite confident that they have enough and strong enough reasons, you don't need to go into detail. So you can say like, a couple of examples here, but I know how to prove this, and then you can move on. And this is also one of those things that becomes easier over time, especially if you're debating with the same debate partner over time, because then you just know already what a person means when they're talking about, I'm going to prove polarization in politics, because then you just have like know already what they tend to give as reasons for why it's true or why it's important. So this is also one of those things where I'm encouraging you to try to maybe get a bit more experience already when you're going to maybe for a tournament, your first novice tournament. Maybe already try to do some online spars, on some spars at your institution if that's possible, and then try to get to know each other. Kind of like what are the arguments they tend to make, what are the ideas they have, how do they kind of like raise them, and that kind of stuff. And then after that kind of like communication, the idea becomes that you're going to prioritize. So you prioritize which argument do you think are the strongest, which is an opening half. And after that, it's just basically going to be which one do you think your opening half will not bring, and therefore which one is the most likely kind of like candidate for an extension. Then after that time, it tends to be very useful to actually have some alone time again. So it's important for the person who is going to make the arguments to have some time to write out the case. And here's where you're going to ask yourself quite some questions. So you're going to ask yourself, often, like more often than maybe you're used to, why is this true? So at the moment you need to kind of like think of this as we have like a very small like cousin who's like very annoying, and if you know if they're very young, they tend to just ask this question over and over again, for like, but why is this true? Why? Kind of like just imagine you have that annoying cousin and he's just asking you all of these kind of like questions all the time. And then at the moment you're like, but this is has to be just true. Then ask yourself like two more times, and that tends to be kind of like the length at which point you need to have proven something. Because oftentimes something feels intuitive for you. You've been thinking about it. You have maybe some illustrations in your head. You have some idea of how the world works. But the moment you keep all of that implicit and you don't keep that explicit, then other people might have completely different ideas of how this actually works, or how the world works, or how politics works, and that kind of stuff. So if you are explicit, then you are more likely to prove why your cases happen more often than the other people. So be as explicit as you can. And also, there are other questions that you need to ask yourself, such as how does this link to the motion? So we're talking about polarization, but how does this motion lead to polarization? Similarly, besides asking why is this true, you also need to ask yourself, why is this important? But also maybe why is this the most important thing? So when you talk about polarization, you could talk about, political parties become more extreme when there's more polarization, because the chance of them trying to come in a coalition or being able to form with other parties is just very low. So it tends to more demonize all the stuff. And then you can say this is important for democracy, but if that keeps very abstract, as a judge, you don't really know why you should credit. So you're saying, for example, more concretely. So you could be like, Very concretely, this means that the moment you have discussions at the family table, they just become worse because, you're all disagreeing and you're having such different conception of the world. And it's just not fun. You just disagree. You feel like everyone is very bad. But you can also maybe go for even larger scale impacts, which tend to be things such as, I'm going to try to explain why now politicians are going to call other politicians really poorly, or because they become populist, they don't have good policies and that kind of stuff. And you should ask yourself these things. Why are these things bad? And you should take some time for yourself to really consider, why is this so important, and that kind of stuff. A general tip that I tend to give is, the larger the claims that you make, the more steps you need to do to prove it. So try to really think about, if I'm going to make a larger claim, for example, I need more proof for this. If I make a smaller claim, then it's going to be easier for me to argue this. So that's another thing to take into account. And again, like, these are the questions you can ask yourself when you have the alone time, when you have the time to reflect and take into account all the material your partner has brought. Where you're trying to do this while communicating, you're trying to communicate while also thinking of these questions, then it becomes a bit more muddled and that kind of stuff. Now, this is, of course, the person who's going to make this argument. What is then oftentimes very useful is then the other person who's not making any arguments to then start thinking already of what the other side is going to say. So you can think about, okay, maybe the other side is going to talk about how policies get passed quicker. And then you can always start thinking of rebuttal. Why is this not true? But you can also maybe tell your partner afterwards, like, hey, I think they might bring why policy is going to be passed through quicker. And then you can be like, okay, if that is the case, then maybe we should start some weighing. So when you're saying, like, why does polarization matter more than having quicker policies, for example, that kind of stuff. So it is also, again, useful if at least one of the partners starts thinking about the other side. It's also possible to already consider what other side is going to say, but we're going to talk about that later when I'm going to talk about case generation. I think I saw a question in the chat. So the question is, if we are unable to find the answer to why is that thing true, in that case, should we include those intuitive arguments in our debate? So that's a good question. So at the moment, you're trying to maybe think of an argument, and you can't really explain why it is true. You often have a reason why you kind of like want to make that argument. So it might be that you know an example where it takes place. So when you're talking about, for example, politics being polarized, you can maybe think about the US, and you can be like, okay, I'm having this intuition based on something. I can use this empirical evidence, because empirical evidence in itself is also a proof. So you can also use this. So you can, if there's like an argument. So let me just answer this way. If there's an argument that you really want to prove, and you feel like it's maybe the only argument you can think of, or it's maybe one step of the argument you can't really make, you can either think about this intuition and use that empirical evidence. Maybe, like, from that empirical evidence, be like, okay, but why are these parties acting this way? Why is maybe media like sensationalizing this and that kind of stuff? And then you can start off reasons outside of that. And also, you can ask your partner, right? You have a speaking partner. The speaking partner might have some ideas of why this is true. Let's say this is an argument that you've just thought of, and you thought it has potential, but you can really not answer the main question about why is this maybe linked to the motion? Why is this true? And that kind of stuff. And you have other arguments which are easy for you to prove. I think it would be better to maybe discard that argument. Um, I hope that answers the questions. There's another question, which is, what should be our first preference? Should we make larger claims and support them, or make smaller claims just because it's easier for us to support them? Very good question. And the answer is actually, you can do both. And this is what oftentimes people tend to forget is, let's take the polarization example again, right? When I'm taking a small impact here, which is people are interacting with each other in a bad way, I can talk about this in family measures, saying this is really annoying, this is not productive. People feel kind of like maybe annoyed and despair about politics. And then you take a next step. The next step could be, you have social media, and then you have also polarization, but then it might be even harsher, right? People start calling each other, like, I don't know, woke soyaks, or like, trad wives and that kind of stuff, and just call each other like bad things. And they say, oh, this is already worse. And then later on, you can even make larger claims, which is, again, going for politics and that kind of stuff. I feel like because you have the time, you are able to talk about all of these examples. And you can pick of like the smallest impact we know for sure, that's already important, but then also spend some time on maybe larger impacts. And then you can do, again, some explanation, like, even if it's maybe a bit uncertain, it has a really big impact, so we should really worry about it, that kind of stuff. So the answer is actually, you should try to do both. Because even if you don't prove the full impact, which tends to happen, especially when you're starting debate, you can always have maybe a more smaller impact, and you can still explain why it's important. So again, right, if you take that specific example of like people becoming polarized and not being able to interact with each other well, you could say this just make friends groups more annoyed at each other. You feel like maybe a bit more disillusioned with your family. You just have less hope for maybe the future because again, you see other people being and behaving quite differently to you, and you can't really understand them. You could say that is a small impact, right? Because it's based on like not like the whole world's going to change, but you can make it seem very big by explaining why maybe a person thinks about this a lot, or why hope in the future is just a very good emotion, but also just a very important emotion to have, and that kind of stuff. So um yeah, do all of them and try to do all of them well as well. As I guess my answer to that question. Is there also an audible question? Because I heard some murmur on the background, and I don't know if it's someone trying to ask a question or uh-huh. So then about mechanization and impacting, when should you prioritize one over the other? I think this is a good question because it basically links also to the fourth point, which is I think generally it is fine for the first person to maybe focus a bit more on proving why something is true. The reason being, for the second speaker, they can always be like, look, my partner already impacted this or mentioned this impact. Let me impact this further and maybe give some weighing, right? Give some reason why this is more important than what other people are saying. So I think that's absolutely fair for you as a first speaker, maybe to focus a bit more on mechanization than on impacting. But overall, it really depends on the debate. This is something that I'll get into maybe when we're going to talk about case generation and like communication. If I don't answer the question, just ask me it again over chat and I'll get into more detail. But I would say that's the preference when it comes to speakers. So that is just on the having the alone time again. I'll just move on to the next part, which is the last part of the structure of prep, which is what do you then do after you've come together, or like after you've had some time by yourself, you should try to now come together at least. So try to, as for example, the speaker who speaks first, you have chosen a case. You're like, okay, this is the argument we're going to bring. Just quickly say the argument I'm going to bring is this argument. So I'm going to talk about polarization. And the end goal of this argument is to prove that people feel really shitty and that politicians become really worse, for example, like the policy becomes bad. And then the second speaker can be like, okay, I think that's good. I can think of weighing for that. I could kind of like agree with the case. And I could also like, okay, I think the other side might bring this point about like policy passing through quicker. So maybe here's some preemptive material, or here's some framing that you can already do in your speech, which makes your our argument stronger, that kind of stuff. I think it tends to be quite useful to do this um, because oftentimes where you tend to hyper focus on either one, try to hyper focus on rebuttal or try to hyper focus on just your argumentation, people tend to forget to, for example, place it in debate or combine things together. So when you're making a case, having like some preemption will be good because it makes it stand stronger. But also, if you just focus on proving why something is true and you don't really explain why it is more important than something else, it could also be very useful if your second speaker also tells you, I think of maybe use this weighing on this very proximate to people, or they have this feeling every day. And even if you don't explain it fully, then it's easier for the second speaker to explain that. So this is overall just the general structure of prep. So this is then how you should kind of like try to do it. What is then the way to create arguments? So the idea is the moment that you're going to create arguments, the first thing that you should try to do is just to get as many ideas for cases as you can. And only after that, then you're going to try to maybe think of burdens. For example, what is it that you need to kind of like prove to make it work? But also, what is kind of like the illustration for yourself? So maybe you think about polarization and then you have this specific idea, right? It is that people talk to each other and they get annoyed. And then this is kind of like framing, right? This is kind of like an illustration. So you say, why does this kind of like polarization then bleed into everyday life and everyday interaction and that kind of stuff? So that is the idea that you should do. How to exactly do this, I'm going to get into details, but I'm actually already kind of like interested in to see how you do it. So let's say you have this motion. It's a very classical motion. It's this house would legalize all drugs. Let's say everyone here is on government side. How would you start of thinking of arguments? Does anybody have any ideas? You can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat. Yeah, this is the interactive part. So Okay. Okay. So this is good. I'm already getting a lot of ideas in the chat. So in the chat, it's the idea that you start by defining some benefits. So you start thinking of benefits already. That's quite good. And then we get quite some specific stuff. So it will be about like the black market. If you don't legalize it, there will be black market. It will be bad. I assume that's kind of like the argument. The medicinal benefits of drugs. Um, again, thinking of a specific subset. So like you have drugs, we have then potentially a usage, which is medicinal drugs. It's quite interesting. Um, Kind of like arguments about supervision. So it's the idea that you think about the government is doing this. So you're thinking actively about, okay, we implemented motion, what would happen then? Um, yeah, let me think. Overall, it seems to be the idea that you already start kind of like thinking of impacts, like thinking of arguments or like trying to talk about like people who are, for example, sick and ill getting help. And then after that, kind of like focusing on the other side, which is often called the comparative. So the idea that what if would happen if we don't legalize that kind of impact? Um, Someone is actually trying to bring a principle of inherent freedoms. Also very fun. Okay, these are all a lot of arguments. And these are just kind of like trying to think of like points that are in debate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now give you like bottom up and top down ways of thinking of argumentation that will maybe try to diversify the way that you can think of these things. Because it seems that for me, it's just some people just have ideas that pop up. Sometimes you don't have ideas pop up. What you should maybe do then. So what is the bottom up approach? So the idea is basically you just start from the motion. So sometimes you don't really know maybe the context. So maybe you have a really hard economy motion. But what you can then do, if you don't know that much about economy, you don't know about like what kind of like goes on, you can just start from the motion. So a way to think of this is maybe illustrate for yourself. How does this actively kind of like look like? So how does it look like now? How will it be changed? What will happen when governments will announce that they're going to do these plans? What will this policy kind of like look like? What will considerations be? What will discussions be? All the kind of stuff. You could also think about, do I maybe already know some context in which is the case? So when you're talking about legalizing drugs, you might think about the Dutch when they have, for example, weed being semi-legal, or maybe talking about Portugal where drugs are decriminalized. Maybe you already know a couple of these cases, and then you can think about what does that look like? How does that kind of work? Another thing is you can maybe just ask yourself about completely different actors in debate. So it doesn't even just need to come up with immediate arguments. It might just be already useful to just ask yourself, like, what are different actors? So maybe you can talk about when it comes about politics, you could talk about parties, you could talk about the media, you could talk about individuals who are maybe very political or people who are not political at all. And you can think about all of these actors and you can ask yourself, for these actors, what would change? This is often, I think, the most easier and accessible way for a lot of like new teams to start thinking about new arguments because now they're forcing themselves to really consider outside of what they normally think. There are a couple of like general questions you could ask. So you could say like, how does this happen in developing countries? How does this happen in like maybe for minorities? How does this happen for people who are like maybe wealthy, but maybe people who are less wealthy? All of that kind of stuff. These are general groups you can consider. You can see, do they impact them differently? If so, how they differ? Can we maybe think arguments about how they are impacted? And the last thing is also sometimes there are just a couple of examples in the info slide or a couple of points. So maybe you could just really hone in on one of those. If there's like really a lot going on and you really don't know what's happening, trying to maybe focus on one of those things that are in the info slide can already be useful. So for if there would be an info slide here with legalizing drugs, there might be examples of drugs, and they could be like, okay, seeing as these are all examples of drugs, can we maybe think about why uniquely like heroin legalization is good or bad compared to maybe ecstasy or maybe compared to weed or all of that kind of stuff. So now I've kind of like given you an approach or questions that you can ask yourself. So how would you now tackle the motion this house would legalize all drugs? And maybe again to maybe streamline this question is what question did you ask yourself and then to what answer did you come to come up with a new argument? Again, if people want to do this only via chat, that's fine. If someone wants to unmute themselves and say it, that's also absolutely fine. In the meantime, I'll grab a quick glass of water while people will start to type things out in the chat. So we already get one comment, which is good, which is start with how it looks like when you have no drugs and when there will be drugs. So specifically about stakeholders affected by legalization. Can maybe a bit more specific? What kind of stakeholders are you talking about? Um, okay, how it will impact the general public? Okay, that's already an actor that you are thinking about. That is good. Is there any specific point or argument that you have now from the idea that you're going to consider the general public? Mm-hmm. Okay, okay, okay. That is good. Like the stakeholders are already a bit more explained, more in detail. So in the comments saying like the general public or the government as an authority, how they kind of like changes. Um, yeah, then there's some specific stuff about the sales and purchase of drugs, and the market will kind of like change drastically. That's kind of like good. That's some kind of like way on maybe to illustrate how it will change. And then the question for me then to you would be, for example, what is the specific change that you're highlighting here? Like, are there specific shops that you see this? Do you think that these shops are paying taxes? Do you think that they are legalized? All of that kind of stuff. Yeah. There's a really interesting question, which is just legalization just used to an increased sale of drugs, which is just again illustration of the motion. You can think of yourself, and then you can talk about, okay, how does this look like? And then here's this idea of increased intoxication. So people are taking more drugs and that kind of stuff. And then you can talk about the compromising of public health. That's like maybe a good way to see this. Um, yeah. Okay. So let me maybe see how I did it. A couple of examples, and then after that we can you can ask questions if there's something that's unclear. So, so when I, for example, start illustrating for myself, I start just thinking about, okay, when I think about drugs, I think about drug dealers. And then how do people kind of like get drugs? Well, they tend to just like have drug dealers where they kind of like meet, or you have like groupies that kind of like stand around corners, kind of like shady people. And then I would say, what do I think when you get legalized? Well, you now would go to stores and then it can be bought, which is then much safer. So you could also say this tends to be out of the side of like police, right? Because it needs to be shady. And I'm thinking, okay, if there's no police there, what could be the consequence if there would be no police? Well, then the things of like violence become a bit more likely, extortion. Again, people cannot really go because, again, when they're giving a reason, saying like, I was buying drugs, it seems a bit shady, that kind of stuff. Um, and also, then you could think about, okay, the shops and therefore the safe environment. That would be already just one point that I wouldn't have thought of maybe when I'm just thinking about abstract, where I'm thinking about, oh, like drugs become safer than themselves. I'm not thinking about the environment in which like people get drugs in status quo. Similarly, right, when I just start with the motion, it's like, okay, I'm legalizing it. What does it mean? I just want to be able to be sold in shops. And then I could be like, we can just regulate the drugs and that kind of stuff. Or maybe there's an interesting or fun point, which is when people consume drugs, and for example, in like weed lounges in the Netherlands, but now you have them for other drugs. They are much more likely to have safer trips. Not just because you have professionals there who can give you information, but also the environment is just catered to helping you during that thing. So you don't have too many distractions. You don't have like harsh sounds. You don't have like things that cause anxiety and therefore bad trips and that kind of stuff. So there's another kind of like argument that I just thought of just by just thinking about how would I envision these shops. And then different actors. We have already have the general public, right? So, for example, general public health. Another thing is you can just talk about how drug addicts change, and then it's like, what does it mean to be a drug addict? You'd be like, hey, you kind of like feel shame, you need help. The drugs can be of like low quality, really harming your health. It's hard for you to try anything else or get rid of it. All of the kind of stuff. Um, maybe you're just have less fear for police, and when you're thinking about one of these actors, you now think about a whole kind of like thing, like a whole lot of scalar of things that are influencing this actor. And I can go into these rights. I can be like, we as government are going to talk about the most vulnerable people who are drug addicts, whose life is the most impacted by drugs. And then you just can weigh this, you can impact this, and then you can do this by all of these different ways in which their life gets helped. So this is a way to think of an argument. So even if, again, for example, your opening half already discusses it will be safer because you have police and that kind of stuff, you could be like, even if that reason you cannot use because your opening already used it, the fact that you're now maybe talking about drug addicts and you're talking again about maybe safer usage, but in a different context, you're explaining more what the problem is and how this exactly solves it. You have more nuance, you're having a new impact because this actually wasn't impacting your opening half. That's a whole new argument, even though you might already think like it is somewhat mentioned in your opening. There's also a specific way to deal with this from closing compared to opening. Um, and then there's other stuff that you can think about. Like people who are maybe casual drug users, people who are kind of like interested, and then you can say they are going to use more drugs. And then you can think about maybe like both sides, right? You can say like gov side, this might be good because drugs are fun. On the upside, you might say it might be bad for public health, or they might get addicted and that kind of stuff. So let's see if there were any question in the meantime. Um, So is fair for opposition to claim that the premise that prescription substances already exist in this specific context? That is kind of fair because I think in most cases opposition is just already defending like the status quo. And in the status quo, some places like weed is illegal, but then medicinal weed is legal for like anxiety reasons. So you just need a prescription. Or again, like ADHD medication is just accessible if you have an ADHD diagnosis and you get it prescribed from like your psychiatrist. Okay. In the meantime, other people are also talking about like arguments that you could talk about. So, for example, rehabilitation, indeed, or more likely to receive medical care, which also good arguments. Um, but let's just go maybe now to the top-down approach and see another way to kind of like go around this. So this is, I think, most likely the thing that you'll use the most times because oftentimes, especially if you're new, you tend to just struggle with maybe perceiving what are the general arguments you can make or what's the general context of this, especially if you have very difficult international relationships motions or economy motions and that kind of stuff. So what is then the top-down approach? So the top-down approach is that you already kind of like have an end goal in mind. Um, so instead of like thinking just of what are the actors involved or how does legalization look like or what are the examples, you always start thinking of an impact. And I feel like this is already what some of you were doing when you were talking in the comments about how would you think of arguments because you're thinking of kind of like related points in the motions. So for example, when we're talking, let me just actually use an example that was in the chat, maybe to make it a bit easier. If you were talking about kind of like cartel, so you can maybe talk about one of the big problems is cartel violence. And even though you don't start with just the actors' cartels, you now have a specific thing. So even if you don't think about cartels, you might think of cartel violence in, for example, Latin America. And I think, how would this actually change under legalization? That would be one example to kind of like do this. But another way to think about this is sometimes when you just hear a word, you already have some preconceived notions about things that are related to it. So if you have a motion on political parties, and like banning religious parties and that kind of stuff, then what can you talk about in politics? Well, we're having a lot of problems with polarization or have problems with populism and that kind of stuff. And then you just take one of those end points, which is more or less polarization or more or less populism, and then you ask yourself, how do I like go from the motion then to this point? Another thing that you can do is if you really have a lot of trouble, you can think about the other side. So when you're thinking, for example, to yourself and you ask yourself these bottom down methods and nothing's really helping, you could think about what would I say on the opposition side? And then you can either just think of rebuttal, maybe the exact opposite of what they're saying. So like a flip of their case, or maybe like a framing or characterization that outframes it. So for example, when it comes about political parties, you could say you get quicker policy, and then you could think, okay, but why would quick policy may be bad? And you'd be like, well, if you have a lot of quick policy, policy might overturn each themselves. And policy overturns themselves, it means that you don't really have any cohesion on plans, which means that companies, for example, don't really know what to expect. People need to change, for example, their financial stability or like the financial situation or the way they handle things, because again, the government is constantly changing the bureaucratic hoops that you need to go through to get something done, all of that kind of stuff. So you now actually have gone from something that was actually a positive on their side, which is you have a lot of policy and it happens quickly, to now a negative. Again, something you might not have even thought of if you weren't asking yourself, is there maybe a way that sometimes this is bad? So again, I'm going to now give you some time to think about the motion, which is this house would legalize all drugs. And then again, the question is, if you have like try to maybe write down what is the question that you ask yourself, and then what is the argument that came from that question that you've asked. It means I'm also turn on a light and you can type this up in the chat. Or again, if someone feels like bold and wants to unmute, that's also absolutely fine. Okay, in the meantime, we've gotten some answers. There's another question, which is a bit more about specific prepping. I'll leave that when we're like going towards the communication side. So I'm seeing a question. I'll answer a bit later just to have the exercise flow a bit quicker. So kind of like the question is, what do I need to prove? And then the question is, legalization is good. Um, I feel like this is a fair question that you should ask, but I feel like this actually is at a later stage. So when you're asking for yourself, for example, in this case about demotion, it's like what endpoint are you trying to read? Um, Similarly, there are like a lot of points like, okay, how the legalization of drugs will be beneficial to the society. That might be also like a good question to ask yourself. But I still think it is still relatively broad because from that question, you're not really making an argument yet. So one of the things that's highlighted below is, for example, the example of crime. So then, yes, you can think about crime. For example, crime happens with drugs, and then you can think about how would this, for example, stop it. So it would be a good thing. Um, okay. Oh, it's also interesting. There's like the general problems in society someone's talking about because, for example, people can be stressed within society, and then they have a temporary relief. That's also a good idea. And then you could think about, okay, so then the underlying point is people are kind of like stressed. And then that moment you ask yourself, what do I need to prove to make this argument? So to prove this argument, I would need to say there's quite a big demand for people to not be stressed. That would be the first thing. And I give a lot of things, be like people are working 9 to 5, people feel isolated, all of that kind of stuff. So they need something to relieve all of that stress. And then the second question I should ask myself, which is linked to the motion. Why are specifically drugs so good in relieving stress? And then I can talk about, well, drugs are effective because they, are direct, right? They are directly changing your brain. It is a guaranteed kind of thing because again, if you take drugs, kind of like guaranteed what the effect will be. Whereas, for example, meditation or playing video games is a bit uncertain what the outcomes will be. You could talk about how it is relatively quick, so therefore it is more useful when people already have busy schedules. Mhm. Yeah, and then yeah, and then there's a question which is like, how's the world now without legalization and how it will kind of be? I feel like this is more of a bottom down question, but I think it's also a good question to ask yourself. So bottom down, this would be again, you have a lot of problems with drugs. It's kind of like shady, but now you get into better places. Okay, there's another problems that the people are highlighting, which are just again problems that come from outside and you can link to the motion, which is like the judicial like judiciary has less things that they need to care about. So these are like I think the lawyers and like the judges and like all the organization that goes behind court cases because again people are not going to be prosecuted. I think it's overall quite fair. Again, the question that you ask yourselves then, why is decision important impact? Why is this uniquely solved by legalization? And then also you could ask yourself, what would the other side say? But we can get into more detail about that later. There's another example here, which is a bit more. It's a question in history: has something similar happened? And if so, what's the result? Um, and then there's the prohibition example that basically helped like crime syndicates, and you got bad alcohol and all the kind of stuff. I've got like paraphrasing here. So these are all kind of like good questions that you're asking yourself. Maybe like to highlight what I maybe tend, what I kind of like mean is, so bottom up questions are questions of the motion happens. We have ideas. What kind of actors are there? Like, drug users, that kind of stuff. Illustration for himself. Has something happened to that before? Top down, in the end, is I already have an idea of what I want to prove. Now I just need to link it to the motion. Or I've already know a couple of things that are tend to be linked to these kind of motions. So I want to talk about this. So drugs are always linked with crime. Drugs are also often linked with like relief and that kind of stuff. So even if you hadn't thought of this from like the bottom down of like drug users or extra kind of stuff, these are endpoints that you can ask yourself. Um, yeah. So these are the kind of things that I mean with top down. So what are the things that I then had as examples? And then after that, I'll answer the question that was asked earlier, which is was someone also talking about it, which is like general violence. Like I know violence is linked to this. How kind of like can they be stopped? A couple of things here. You could talk about how they're outcompeted by legal businesses. Again, you think about this, and I'm saying, okay, they get outcompeted by legal businesses. And for me, this feels very intuitive. But I need to ask myself, why is this true? Because it might be the case that the opposite is true, that actually cartels now outcompete these companies, and cartels become even bigger because they have a wider base. So then the question you ask yourself is, why do they outcompete? They need to explain uh like for example, more people want to go to like legal places, so you can ask yourself, say it's often safer, you could say it's cheaper, um that kind of stuff. But also you could say they just have better capacity. That's to say maybe they are more convenient. You can always know where the shop is, but with a drug dealer you need to have like a lot of steps to get into contact with them in the first place, all of that kind of stuff. So then you can say overall actually it is quite hard for you to go to the other side. And this is why I'm saying like ask yourself more often, why is this true? Because even if you think, oh no, clearly they're going to out people, because clearly people are going to go towards these companies, you still need to explain why. And then the next question is, I'm saying, for example, it is safer, and then it's just like very intuitive maybe, but like why is the primary reason that people make choices, for example, that it is safe? You could be like, well, people really fear the police and they really fear violence. It's something very visceral to them to try to minimize this, and that kind of stuff. Why am I saying that you also need to prove that? Because it might be the case that on the other side, someone tries to prove actually illegal drugs will always be cheaper. And if illegal drugs will always be cheaper, it is much more likely that these illegal drugs have, because they don't need to go through testing, they don't need to go through like all the bureaucracy, they don't need to have a shop that is actually, paying the rent and that kind of stuff. So therefore, they're going to be cheaper. So if the main reason why people go to one place over another is actually the price, then at that point, even if it is safer, they'll forgo that safety and then go to something that's actually cheaper. So again, this shows, I think, two things. One, ask yourself why a lot. Two, think about the other side and potentially could then already start to think about why I need to prove these kinds of things. So that's a kind of like a specific example. Aryan, you already have a question. Yeah, you can put in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just had a question. The third point where it says the opposition will run drugs are harmful. You've written drugs are mind expanding. Could you please elaborate on that point a bit?
Yeah, I'm going to get to those 2 points. That's a very good question. So the first thing is sorry, second thing I'll just quickly go over and then I'll go to the third thing. So the second thing is drug waste issues in the Netherlands. So you could be like, maybe if you live in the Netherlands, then you have known that a couple of the problems is that because a lot of like drugs are made illegal here, such as ecstasy and cocaine, and we're one of like the biggest creators of like illegal drugs in Europe. There's also a lot of like waste issues in the sense that you have all of these heavy chemicals. You can't dispose of them legally because it's very sus if like suddenly I go to like the places that get rid of these chemicals, be like, oh no, I'm just your average farmer, and I suddenly have all these chemicals which are linked to making heroin, and then just get rid of it. So they oftentimes dump it in water, which oftentimes have a lot of like spillover effects. Which means that, for example, agriculture becomes worse, people in the community get sick, all of that kind of stuff. So again, these are things that if you, for example, read about it and know about it, these are things that you can expand on and think about. And you can make a whole argument about this. Yeah. And then the last question is, let's say you now have a thing that the other side says, which is um, the other side might say drugs are going to be harmful. And then the flip of this actually saying no, drugs are going to be good. What are kind of like ways you can explain drugs are good? I think, for example, the stress relief that somebody talked about in the chat is already a good example because you can say taking some drugs after a stressful day will be very good for people. It will be very like nice for them to actually de-stress. You don't get burnouts, all of that kind of stuff. That's very good. Um, when I'm talking about like mind expanding stuff, what I'm thinking about is there are people who are talking about like what's it called? Like LSD and those other kind of like hallucinogenic drugs. And then suddenly they feel, for example, one with the world or with the universe or with their friends and that kind of stuff. One of I think the side effects of I think MDMA or like other kind of like party drugs is that you're also like very loving to your friends and that kind of stuff. So what happens there is you become a bit more introspective or you're going to maybe think of yourself in a completely different way. And it also actively rewires, for example, your brain. So then you start thinking about yourself as maybe being less significant because you're thinking about yourself in, the context of the whole universe, or we're all part of this. But it also means that you feel less burdened because now you're thinking of like in the whole thing of what is the universe, what is all going on in my life is actually not that big. Like it's not that important. So it can be like just very stress relieving. Or when it comes to friends, when you're feeling like very heavy emotions with your friends, it might actually also mean that you feel actually closer to them. You might feel emotionally alleviated when you're, for example, taking a trip with them, and therefore you just feel like you're generally better buddies, and that it just has a good impact on your relationship, which then also might impact your life better because again you have better buddies around and that kind of stuff. Again, what you're thinking about here are just a couple of examples. And a good way to then also think is, okay, I'm thinking of all of these examples, and I still need to think about how do I place this in debate or how do I kind of like do this. Um, after what you should, for example, think about is in this case, I'm talking about specific kind of drugs, right? So I'm talking about hallucinogenics, I'm talking about party drugs, I'm talking about weed, all that kind of stuff. These are soft drugs or hallucinogenic drugs, but these are not things such as hard drugs. So most likely, and I'm going to be fair, it is hard for you to defend that cocaine and heroin are going to be mind expanding and a good experience. Um, Actually, heroin tends to be pretty bad, not only because of the effects of like your harm, like you're being harmed, like it has bad effects on your liver, on your brain, you have dependency, you become addicted, all this stuff. But another thing is heroin gives you such a big high that oftentimes people after having been induced need to now kind of like have a mourning process in which they will realize that they will never be as happy as they were taking that heroin in their daily lives when they are going to be sober. Again, this is some accidental like spec that I wanted to talk about. So again, you then realize, okay, this is the case in some drugs. So then you realize I need to talk about why these drugs are the most often used. So then you say, okay, why is it that most likely these soft drugs are most likely to be used? And then you say, look, people still have a lot of fears of these hard drugs. They have seen people become addicted. They have seen people like doing really bad things when they see junkies on the street doing like spasming out or like being zombies as you had in like a couple of cities in the US, then they're going to be like that's going to be very scary, illusionary to them, and therefore they don't want to do it. But again, I think generally everyone will still advise them to not take hard drugs but do take like again these nice hallucinogenics and nice soft drugs and that kind of stuff. And then you can say, look, even if some of them are bad, most of them are good, and the ones that consume most are going to be good. And again, you can then do say this is very important to them via this framing on why it's going to be mind expanding. Um, so there were a couple of questions. So the question is, since there's a regulation on drugs, black markets will exist. How is the solvency provided? Um, is this a question for me to answer about the argument, or is this a question that you want to ask yourself during prep? If this is a question you want to ask yourself during prep, I think this is an excellent question. If it's the other one, I could go a bit into detail, but I don't know if that's what everyone wants because we also want to talk about other things for prep time. Um, yeah, another example is like euphoria, reducing stress. That's a good example of like why drugs are going to be mind expanding. And there's another question that was actually at the beginning of the exercise I wanted to answer is in the case given, it's not very particular. What is the best way to prep? Keep the speeches vague or pinpoint to key points and support them using claims. So Arjen, what do you mean with this? Do you think that are you asking that during the speech, it is best to keep claims kind of like vague about what you're trying to prove, or what are you trying to say with like trying to keep the speeches vague?
So, if the motion given to us is not very particular, it is not pinpoint, does not have a context slide or a brief about it, then how do we go about it? Do we need to, so if you said that we need to focus on the soft drugs, so does the first speaker mechanize upon the benefits of the soft drugs and the second speaker goes upon impacting that, and we turn the motion towards how we see it appropriate, or keep it vague and talk about everything that comes to the mind first?
So, so when it comes, so let me just say the distinction maybe between during prep time and during the speeches. If it is during prep time, I feel like what you should do is, while you also have time for yourself, is I'm now giving you a lot of material, right? So I'm giving you a lot of things that, ways of questions you can ask about, and a lot of like arguments that you can talk about in different contexts. So again, the Netherlands is specifically drug waste issues, but then again, other countries might not have these issues. What you should try to think for yourself is kind of like curated already when you're talking to your speaking partner. So when you talk to your speaking partner, you should ask yourself, what is most likely the easiest one that's proven? What is like maybe a large impact that we can have like claim? Like if you need to go through a lot of steps of explaining why something is bad, it might be good to focus on something that has a bit less steps and is maybe again a bit more close to the motion. And that kind of stuff. And then you can maybe think very broad. But it would be good to already have a selection. Then at the moment you have this selection where you have some priorities in which you say, I think some of the arguments are stronger than the other. This is also what you then tell your partner. I'll be like, so the strongest arguments I can think of legalizing drugs is it stops violence. You are able to help drug addicts. People can have mind expanding stuff. And then you can say, also, I have thought of other arguments, which I thought were a bit less important, which were like, for example, drug waste. And then you can say, the problem that I have with this argument is if you explain why drug waste is overall bad, there are kind of like easier arguments you can make, which is that like illegal drugs are made badly or poorly and that kind of stuff, and that kind of thing. So I think that would be like you said, like there's less. I don't need to do the extra step of being the waste being harmful and how many people it affects, because it's more intuitive for people to explain why the thing themselves, like the drugs being bad, is just harmful for the users. For example, there's more secure harm. But you could be like, maybe we don't have an extension, right? Opening government runs all three, and you have only that one point about drug waste, then you could potentially run it as an extension. Um, and then that's the way I would do it. Depends on the details. So if you have a lot of material that you want to cover, then I would spend less time on these like separate points. I would be like, oh, I have separate points, and I would just name drop them. And I spend more time on what I think are going to be the major points. And also, again, you can already have some self-selection. So especially if you're closing half, if you feel like opening government will have to bring this argument, I would still say it. So I'd still say, I feel like the OG argument would be here, you get safer drugs, you get less violence. If they don't prove it, we can still prove it. And then after that, you can a bit more focus on what you think are going to be the new case that they haven't talked about. So again, this might be they're not going to talk in detail about addicts, or they're not going to talk about other arguments that we've talked about. So maybe drug cartels and that kind of stuff. And then you can say, we are going to talk about this, and then you can do the more detailed stuff. Yeah, that is overall the things is. And if you're saying the question, I think there was also some other way you could interpret your question, which is if you have a very abstract like motion as this, where it isn't pinpointed, so it isn't like this house as the Netherlands would legalize all drugs or all of that kind of stuff, what would you do? I feel like if you make general arguments, those apply in a lot of contexts. So when you talk about illegal drugs being made poorly, oftentimes you don't require specific context here. And then I feel like you can make like that argument like the best, because then it is not tied to one specific context. So I would try to stay as broad as you can when you're making these kind of arguments, because if you're really just focusing in on the Netherlands has this specific problem and this is like solved with this, it could be like, okay, sure, the Netherlands is maybe what 18 million people. The world has 7 billion people. So if there are always going to be more people helped, if, for example, the US with the war on drugs they have there, that's a more meaningful impact. So try to remain broad. And if you really, really don't know what to do and you just have a specific context in mind, which might be Latin America, then you can do it because it's still relatively big, but then you need to weigh on something else. So you cannot say everyone gets helped by this because cartels are mostly active only in Latin America. So then what you could say is, but the harm that we're talking about is super duper severe because people lose their lives over these cartel violence. They have a lot of corrupt power over the governments and that kind of stuff. So if you cannot weigh on the most broad thing and you're contextualizing yourself, then you should weigh on something else. Again, these are two different ways of answering your question. Does this make sense? If you have any other questions, you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Okay, yeah. So let me just then talk about content creation pitfalls. I'll just do this quickly because I've mentioned
Excuse
this
me.
already a couple of times. Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah, I had this question about how are we going to provide solvency in this case, where if the government does have some kind of regulations on drugs, then there's going to be a black market for it. So I don't know how to deal with this particular problem. So what is your advice, opinion?
So here's the thing, right? So this is a very good question, which is sometimes you cannot rebut a claim. And the reason is it's just true. So if you legalize drugs, there will be a black market. Like you cannot dispute it. Where you can dispute it is how big is that black market or how bad does that black market become? So you could say we might not get rid of every illegal like interaction, but we're going to get of the worst kind, the most violent ones, that kind of stuff. So you could say the black market will exist, but it will have to be nicer to their clients because if they're going to rob them or commit violence, then they'll get scarred and they won't go towards illegal things, and they will now go to, for example, the safer shops and that kind of thing. So then you can say, look, even if the black market exists, the black market becomes better. I think that's maybe a way to say it. Or you could say the amount of lives that we save is just larger because it just becomes smaller. So like, yes, the black market exists because many more people will prioritize their own safety and therefore go to these legal things. So a lot of drug addicts who would go normally to these illegal ones now go to the legal ones and then they are safe. That's maybe the way to think about it. It's more about, I guess, weighing. We'll get a bit more details about that later. I hope this answers your question. So again, I'll just do a bit kind of like quickly over the pitfalls. I already explained you should ask yourself why more often than you may be used to. Ask yourself like really a lot of times. And when you really at some point where it's just like this is just empirically true, or there's no way to really explain this, that's often when you get to the right level. Especially in the beginning, I would recommend asking your judge or the chair, but like, did I sufficiently explain this? Or should I ask myself even more often this why question? So one also what you should do is you don't think in your prep time what others are going to say, because at the moment you have to do this during debate, you have to make notes, you have to make arguments, you have to think about how your argument interacts with their argument. So make it easy for yourself. Already start thinking about what the other side will say, and they can already prepare some rebuttal. You can already have some ideas on how you could deal with this. Another thing is not linking to emotion. So just force yourself to ask, how does my problem about cartels really link to the motion? And make it also clear, because some judges, if they don't really understand it, they're going to be very harsh on this and not going to credit you. So there's still quite something that I want to talk about. So I'll just forego the example because there's still some stuff about communication. If you want to see this, I'll just leave it on here that you can watch on the recording what it says. Or we can just do this during the question after the workshop. So how do you then communicate during prep? So I think most likely the best thing to do when a lot of things already kind of like explained. Oh, sorry, there's another question. I'll just answer that first. Is when we are given emotions, better discuss its inherent nature philosophically with humans and the right of freedom of nature and every individual, or very macro level or direct impacts to real world impacts of the same. So that's a very good question. The answer to that is, in principle, judges should be able to credit and understand principles. The main problem is principles tend to be somewhat hard to prove, and judges tend to discredit them. So my honest reaction is, for practical reasons, you should most likely focus on a couple of practical impacts, but don't forgo the principle. You can have these principles really explain why bodily autonomy is really important. And if you feel confident about that, then go for it. But I feel like if I would have to make a choice where I just could run a practical or could run a principle, I oftentimes see myself running the practical because I'm more likely to believe that the judge will actually buy it, because I don't have the accurate burdens to prove it. However, definitely also try to run a principle a couple of times, because you can only become better with the feedback of the judge that you're going to give, that you're going to be, what you're going to get. So yeah. Okay. What is the communication that you do during prep? So let's say you're, for example, now in the phase where you're going to start about the cases. Overall, when it is, for example, a pro-am where one is more experienced than the other person or just knows a lot more about debate. So I like sports a lot. So if I'm with someone who doesn't like sports, even if they're really good, I would be maybe able to explain what the argument is, what the context and that kind of stuff. So then oftentimes it is easier for a new person to then just listen to what the person is saying, give all this context, and then maybe fill in some extra gaps or maybe fill in some like ideas that they have. They have more of a structure they can put the ideas in. This is what I would recommend. So first have the pro talk, and then maybe have the M like think about it themselves. If it is relatively equal, or you don't really have this kind of like preference, what I would always recommend is for the constructive speaker to go first, and then the second speaker. The reason being, the constructive speaker already needs to explain this and needs to make clear in a second what is the main point of the case. If you're able to convince your partner of this and communicate that clearly, then that's already something that you can take into account when you're explaining what you're going to prove in the debate. And also it kind of like can forces the second speaker to be like, oh, I like this argument. Here's an impact that I kind of like have thought of this link to this, or here's some weighing that you can also consider and that kind of stuff. This is what I would recommend. What is it then? How you like talking to each other? I think the first thing that you kind of like should do is when you're giving an argument, for example, having safer like things, then start with the endpoint. So the endpoint is we are going to legalize drugs, and then there's going to be less violence when people buy drugs. Like that's the endpoint, or we will try to prove this. And then you start also thinking about like what the first person like who's like giving you this case is, and also giving some arguments, like some framing, like framing about, for example, the shops, framing about maybe having less police there, and maybe police use a lot of violence in general, that kind of stuff. And then the other person can then interject. So they can say, okay, you're giving me this rebuttal about drugs being unsafe, but maybe I would rebut this by giving you this rebuttal. In this case, would be like, but drug dealers don't really have the incentive to harm their own clients, because if they harm their own clients, they would never come back. And then you would say, okay, let me think of this. Do we think this completely devastates the case and if we cannot bring it at all? Or do we think that maybe we need to bring some preemption? Or maybe the other person says, I think you have really good points on why it's become safer. I have a whole new point that you haven't considered yet, which is, for example, how the police interacts with these communities and therefore why they get safer. And then you can add to that argument. And then after all of that discussion, if there's other cases that the first speaker like has not thought of, then the second speaker can, explain the case, and then the first speaker takes over the role of the person who's reacting to it, interjecting, maybe thinking of rebuttal, maybe thinking that. Then you're going to discuss which cases do you think are the strongest. And I think that basically what's the most important thing is that if you are in a deadlock at the moment that you cannot agree, and what you should try to do is come to unanimous conclusions. But if you cannot agree, then the first speaker who's going to like give the case should actually choose the case. The reason being that they know what they are comfortable bringing. If they're going to try to bring a case which they don't understand or they don't believe in, they're unable to prove it. And then the second speaker oftentimes cannot like fix it or cannot like, bring new arguments and that kind of stuff. So again, it becomes kind of like very fuckery. So try to not do it. And what also might be important is to impose yourself a rule, which is, let's say you get stuck, right? You're squabbling over whether something breaks the motion or like breaks the debate or not, sorry, if a rebuttal breaks the argument that you're trying to make, you could say, okay, if I'm unable to convince the other person in 30 seconds that actually this doesn't break the debate, then I cannot explain this in 30 seconds towards the judge. So therefore, we should discard this argument. So those are the things that you should consider. This can depend per speaking partner. Sometimes there's speaker partners who just like dislike arguments and be like, nah, this isn't a good one. But then they hear you bring it in debate and they're like, oh, actually, I'm kind of like convinced by it. I thought of some weighing and I can do it. Sometimes people are more stubborn and that kind of stuff. But the main important thing to remember is that you are helping each other. So when a person is, for example, giving you, oh, this case doesn't work if this rebuttal exists, don't take this personally as like an attack on you or the case or saying that you're wrong. You're trying to make the case even stronger by taking into account these points. So I'm already noticing that it's already been more than an hour, so I'm just going to go quickly over to the other slides that we have. I feel like a lot of it has already been discussed during either the examples or previous slides, so I will just go over it. So extensions, I will do this relatively quickly. I can just do this in like 2 minutes. So the idea is, like I said, you're going to have a couple of cases. You're going to think my OG will bring most likely these arguments. I will bring the next best argument. What's the best argument? Depends. Like it's a large scale. It's very important to people. Depends on the context. What is then important to note is you should track your opening well. So sometimes what people will do is they will hear, for example, in OG, the prime minister, they will hear the two arguments the prime minister bring, and then they don't hear what the deputy prime minister brings, which is sometimes rebuttal, but sometimes can be a whole case, which is then disguised as rebuttal. That they don't track their opening half, and they don't see that they're bringing a case that's already brought. So be very mindful, be very paying attention also to the second speaker. This does mean that you have less time to write down because sometimes people start like writing stuff down during DPM. That is why you need time and to prioritize already during prep time and try to focus on one of the cases you're going to try to work out so you are able to track your opening half. Also, kind of like think of rebuttals. So when your other side of opening opposition brings a rebuttal to your opening government, ask yourself, does this rebuttal defeat OG? If the question is yes, okay, does it also beat me? If the answer is no, leave it. Don't rebut the rebuttal because it becomes weird. It's also not necessary for you to win. So it's like not always important. And also, this is very important. For the love of God, bring one extension. So I've seen people try to run 3 or 4 extensions. I have never seen someone give a really good speech and been able to bring 3 or 4 extensions in the closing off. I would say if you can win with 3 extensions, you can win with 1 extension. What you need to do is you need to explain why something is true, why something is important, why it is more true than what your opening half is saying, why it's more important than what your other half is saying, and you need to rebut, and you need to respond to possible rebuttal. That means you have a lot of things to do. Make it clear for the judge by engaging in as much material. How do you do it? Not by bringing 5 separate points, but by bringing 1 point and bringing it really well. So if there's anything you take back from this workshop, it is really only bring 1 extension. Okay. And then lastly, I just have a couple of things on weighing, which is sometimes people don't really know how to weigh their extensions. Here are just a couple of things that you can consider. You could do things just like skill, so more people, severity, how big the harm is, kind of like a duty. So if you want to bring a principle, you can also use it as weighing. So you'd be like, we are able to give people more mind expanding drugs, which is good. But you say this is even more important because we're also fulfilling the principle of the right to bodily autonomy, or the state has specific duty to these people, all that kind of stuff. Kind of like certainty is something as well. If someone needs to go through a lot of things they need to prove to make the case stand, you could be like, it's very uncertain if all of those cases are true all of the time. We need to prove less, therefore we're more certain. And also kind of like timelines, so like short term versus long term. How long does the harm occur? That kind of stuff. And then if you're going to do something, especially as a whip, the best thing to do is first do best case scenario weighing and say like, look, even if you prove all of the benefits, our benefits outweigh yours for these reasons, and then start doing rebuttal. Because you will miss some material, you will not have the time to react to everything. Doing some even if doing some best case scenario weighing is something that's more likely to actually give you a win than having a lot of like destructive rebuttal. So that being said, are there any other questions either about the examples or any of the last slides or anything else that maybe you've struggled with when you were debating? Mm-hmm. So actually, I see an interesting question, which I think is also like part to one of the examples that we had in the exercise, which was how does legalizing drugs reduce violence? Because I said like, you're not going to have those shady dealers who might like beat you up and take your money, or you're not going to go to unsafe areas, which means the chance of you being robbed or just violence happening in general is already going to be higher, all the kind of stuff. And then they say, because if you legalize this, more people use drugs, and when they are under intoxication, they kind of like are going to do more crimes, or they might become violent because they're under intoxication. Or again, if you give the example of addiction, you could be like, if they're very addicted, they need to have a lot of money to kind of like buy these drugs all of the time, and therefore they tend to go to petty crimes because they're thinking about the drugs, and the quickest way to get it is just via crimes. There's a workable way to prove it, and I would say that's actually a really good point and a really good way to flip a case. So you might hear, for example, someone talk about violence, and then you can think of, but I've heard of all of these reasons why you actually get more violence, and suddenly you can think of a way to flip this case. This can be either during the debate, or you could also do this actually already during prep, which is if like your opposition and your second speaker suddenly says like, oh, I've heard, I think maybe that they could bring this argument, then you could start thinking like, there's a way to flip this. So how to approach a motion in which burden identification is a difficult task to do? Good question. Let me ask to you, what is it, like what kind of motions do you struggle with identifying burdens? Because there tend to be general burdens that you can ask yourself. So one of those things is, if you're going to explain that an actor is going to act a specific way, you're going to need to prove both incentive and capacity. So if you're going to say the media is going to polarize people, you need to show that, one, they have the incentive to do so. So you could say, if people are very polarized, people are going to buy the news a lot and they're going to watch the news a lot. That creates a lot of ad revenue, and that means you're going to get a lot of profits. So that's the incentive. And then you need to do the capacity analysis, which is, why does the media have the possibility to actually make people more polarized? And then you could say, people oftentimes trust the media, or when it's online, it's also they see it a lot and they kind of like internalize it because they see it a lot and never see it as true. And therefore, the moment you are exposed to it more and more, it gets part of your worldview, and therefore you are polarized. And then now you have explained why media has the incentive and the capacity to polarize someone. And then the burden is, for example, again, after this, how is this linked to the motion? How does this motion mean that media have more or less incentive? Or how does it stop them? Why do they suddenly have more or less capacity to polarize people, for example? And another thing to do is then to say, the other burden is, you've explained why polarization happens, but the moment you're going to go for small impact, which is people kind of like become annoying dicks, is something that you like can explain more easily. But if you're having a larger claim, which is political parties have really bad policy, you need to explain why, for example, people, because they are polarized, are going to vote for parties which are like having bad policy. So they need to explain, why would the parties that they vote for be extreme, for example, and why do extreme parties have bad policy? So you can say they actually don't cater, for example, towards a specific policy plan, but they oftentimes focus on things which just sounds good. So, for example, in the Netherlands, you have a far right party, and then they're going to think like, we're going to stop a lot of immigration, we're going to go outside of like the pact that we have with the EU with immigration, because it just sounds good. But that's the way they get voters, but they don't really focus on rationally explaining why that is maybe a good or bad policy. And then that burden is then, okay, then they don't really think about this. And then the next burden becomes, why is it then that this is then a bad thing, or that this policy has bad impacts and that kind of stuff? So it is like, I guess burdens are sometimes something that's pushed on you when you're starting to ask yourself, why is this true? Or why is this unique? Or why does this change? Or why is this important, or most important stuff, and that kind of thing. So maybe the best way to do this burden identification is just ask yourself, why is it true? Why is it comparative / linked to motion? Why is it the most important thing? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, another question is, how effective are examples if you want to prove a point, or are they not sufficient? So, I mean, so there's a couple of things. So according to the manual, examples are like empirical evidence, you could call them that, are like legitimate ways of proving something. The main thing is, sometimes you have maybe a good example, which is Portugal, but then you could say there might be a case where they also tried to legalize it, and then it went poorly. So then the point is, you say sometimes it's good, the other one says sometimes it is bad, and then it becomes a bit confusing which one is more likely to happen. So oftentimes the way that I would use examples is for myself to think about, okay, but why did it go so well in Portugal? So you can say the reason why it went so well in Portugal is because the moment it's decriminalized, you can literally have a drug dealer standing outside of the train station in Porto, who's then going to approach you saying, "Hey, do you want to buy drugs?" I'm saying, "No, thank you." And then there's literally police 10 meters away from that who are literally watching that whole interaction. So that's like, okay, that's an example that I have. And I can, there's maybe like a reason I could give, like a structural reason or that kind of stuff. Or you can illustrate it, right? With this illustration, I can, for example, make it clear how impactful that is for maybe me when it comes to like how relieving of stress it is, or how much safer I feel on the street, because even drug dealers are going to be seen as kind of decent people who are just selling stuff, that kind of stuff. So for general, if you're trying to explain why it's true, try to think why is that example true, and if it comes for example, impact, try to explain then also why is this so meaningful for people and that kind of stuff. But I'm not opposed to using examples in speeches. I don't think you should get rid of them. I think sometimes they can be very illuminating and kind of like explaining how you see the world. Um, so then the question is, how to debate on motions which you practically know nothing about? That is a very, very fair question. So sometimes this is gonna sound rough. Sometimes you just have to take the L. Sometimes it will just be the case that there will be someone who just knows a lot about econ. You know nothing at all. How do you then become better? After the debate, you ask the judge, what arguments could we have made? Or if you see someone who's really explaining something well in the speech, in debate, you could be like, I thought you were really good. I was really struggling. Could you maybe give me like ideas for cases, or where did you learn about these things, that kind of stuff. So that would be the thing after the debate that you could do to become better. What could you do like during prep time when it's really hard? Um, to be honest, you can just start thinking about the motion itself. Sometimes when it's about legalization or that kind of stuff, you could just make maybe some marginal impacts. You could be like backlash, and they could be like, why is backlash going to be bad? Or maybe you can start thinking about some principles. So you can say, even if I don't know anything about why an economic policy will actually lead to good outcomes, I could say that the state should try to have as little power over humans as possible, because the state is very coercive. People do not consent to being born under the state. All these general reasons why you can give. And they can be like, even if it leads to bad outcomes, we have this kind of like principled duty to not have this policy, or like have the government intervene as little as possible, or that kind of stuff. Or you could be like, again, people hear this, it's not even about backlash, but you could say people hear it in the media, and certainly there's a lot of like uncertainty. So if they feel like suddenly companies get a lot of rain, and they hear about companies being able to do whatever they can via this policy, it might make them fearful of like what happened in 2008 when you had a housing crisis, when banks were also like very like, what's it called, like didn't have that many rules on them imposed and that kind of stuff. So talk a bit about like, I guess, narratives, or talk about that kind of stuff. Um, and if and that is what I would like maybe recommend. And the way to ask yourself, just think of different actors. Maybe think of just like the very, very basic thing of how will the government implement this, all of that kind of stuff. Um, but yeah, I hope that it answers the questions sufficiently on how you can debate motions that you know nothing about. I also know that was a workshop from that's going to be online as well. It was for Glasgow EUDC training camp. There was a specific workshop on how to debate things that you know nothing about. I can try to send that to someone, and they can send it to you, or you can look it up yourself. I think what they said, or what I got from that workshop, I wasn't actually watching that one, but I heard someone talk about it, was maybe you could think about something that sounds similar to you. So if you don't know anything, for example, about Latin America, and you don't really know that much about, the context there, and this emotion about Latin America, you could be like, okay, I don't know about this context, but I might know a bit about South Africa, because that's where you're from. Then you could be like, oh, in South Africa, this kind of like happens. Maybe something similar could happen, or is likely to happen, and that kind of stuff. And that'd be also another way to think of arguments. Okay. Are there any more questions? Okay, then I feel like the recording can be stopped, or yeah, I'll stay